End quote. Get off my lake right now. Or, I'm calling the sheriff and having you hauled off in zip ties. End quote. That was my welcome to the neighborhood. Not a, end quote, hello, end quote, or a plate of cookies, just that voice, a sound like a rusty chainsaw chewing through a galvanized pipe, cutting right through the morning mist. I stood there on my own wooden dock, the steam still rising from my thermos of black coffee, and I honestly thought for a second I was hallucinating because nobody, and I mean nobody, starts a Tuesday morning with that much unadulterated venom. I turned around slowly to see a woman standing on the edge of the gravel path, her heels digging into the dirt like she was trying to stake a claim, wearing a cream-colored power suit that looked about as comfortable in the woods as a tuxedo at a fish fry. She was vibrating with this strange, manic energy, her finger pointed at my chest like she was aiming a loaded weapon, and she didn't in oppose to even blink when I just raised an eyebrow at her. End quote. I in oppose. Am sorry, end quote. I said, trying to keep my voice as flat as the lake surface behind me, end quote. But I think you in oppose. You got the wrong address, because unless the rules changed overnight, I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to stand on the porch of the house I just paid $500,000 for. End quote. She didn't in oppose. Tea like that. Not one bit. Her face turned a shade of magenta that I've only ever seen on a bruised plum, and she stepped forward until she was practically spitting on my property. Line. End quote. I am Victoria Sterling, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, and you are currently in violation of the exclusive shoreline occupancy mandate. So you can either pack up that tackle box and head inside, or you can explain yourself to the authorities. End quote. Now look, I'm a man who spent 25 years in the trenches of corporate litigation in downtown Seattle. I have survived boardrooms full of sharks who would sell their own mothers for a 2% bump in quarterly dividends. So a woman in a polyester suit didn't end oppose. T exactly make my heart skip a beat. I'd moved out here to the edge of the county, to this little slice of heaven called Spirit Lake, specifically to get away from people who think a manicured lawn is a personality trait. And yet, here was Victoria, the self-appointed queen of the gravel road, trying to tell me where I could cast my line. I just took a long, slow sip of my coffee, let the silence stretch out until it got uncomfortable, and then I smiled, the kind of smile I used to save for witnesses who thought they were smarter than the court reporter. End quote. Well, Victoria, end quote. I said, end quote. It's a pleasure to meet you, truly, but I've read the deed to this cabin about 50 times, and I dawn into oppose. To recall seeing anything about an HOA mandate. So unless you brought a warrant or a very convincing legal brief, I suggest you go find someone else to bully before your heels sink any deeper into my driveway. End quote. She looked like she was about to explode, her eyes darting around like she was looking for a camera to complain to, and before I could even finish my coffee, she had her phone out, fingers flying across the screen as she shrieked into the receiver about a hostile trespasser and a threat to the community's, end quote, moral fabric, end quote. I just watched her, feeling this cold, familiar calm wash over me. The kind of calm you get when you realize the person across from you has just made the biggest mistake of their life by assuming you're a pushover. Victoria saw a guy in a faded flannel shirt and work boots, someone she figured was just another retiree who would buckle the moment she mentioned a fine, but she didn't in oppose. To know that I was the guy who used to dismantle multi-billion-dollar mergers for breakfast. She didn't in oppose. To know that I had moved to this lake because my doctor told me my blood pressure was high enough to power a small city, and she certainly didn't in oppose. To know that she had just picked a fight with the one person in this entire state who knew exactly how to make her life a living hell, legally speaking. By the time the local deputy pulled up, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled all over Victoria's pristine white SUV, she was practically frothing at the mouth, waving her arms like she was guiding in a 747. The deputy, a guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth, stepped out and adjusted his belt, giving me a look that said he'd dealt with Victoria's nonsense twice already that week. End quote. Everything okay here, Mr. Thorne? End quote. He asked, ignoring Victoria's screams for an immediate arrest, and I just handed him the folder I'd brought out from the kitchen, the one containing my title, my survey, and a very fresh fishing license. Miller took a look at the papers, sighed the sigh of a man who is tired of the bureaucracy of small-town egos, and then looked at Victoria with an expression that was somewhere between pity and exhaustion. End quote. Mind oppos. End quote. He said, end quote. This man is on his own land. He's not bothering anyone. And quite frankly, if you don and oppos, T stopped screaming, I'm going to have to talk to you about disturbing the peace. End quote. You could have heard a pin drop on a pillow after that. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a landed carp, her face going through about 6 different stages of grief before she finally hissed that this wasn't and oppos. T over, that she, end quote, owned, end quote, this lake, and that I'd be begging for mercy by the end of the month. She peeled out of my driveway, throwing gravel onto my flower beds, and I just looked at Miller and thanked him, but deep down, I knew this was just the opening act of a very long, very messy play. I spent the next 3 days waking up to orange stickers on my door, fines for, end quote, visual disharmony, end quote, fines for the, end quote, unauthorized scent of wood smoke, end quote, and even a notice that my mailbox was 2 inches too close to the road, a total of $12,000 in penalties in less than 72 hours. I decided then that if Victoria wanted to play games, we'd play by the old rules, the ones written in blood and ink a long time ago. So I headed up to the attic of my cabin, a place I hadn't in oppos. T really explored since the closing. This house had been in the same family since the mid-1800s, sold to me by an estate lawyer who seemed more interested in getting rid of it than checking what was inside, and it was stuffed with a century's worth of junk. I spent hours up there, sneezing in the dust and moving old trunks of moth-eaten quilts, until I found it, a heavy, leather-bound satchel tucked away in a corner behind a stack of 1940s farming journals. Inside wasn't and oppos, T just old letters or recipes. It was a collection of maps, hand-drawn and colored with a precision that took my breath away, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was a document with a faded gold seal. It was a land patent, but not just any patent. It was a direct grant from the United States government signed in 1868, and as I started reading the archaic legal descriptions, the, end quote, meets and bounds, end quote, that define the property, my hand started to shake. I'm a lawyer. I know how title insurance works, and I know that most people assume the, end quote, public, end quote, lake is public, but as I cross-referenced these coordinates with a modern county GIS system on my laptop, I realized something that felt like a lightning strike. The original owner, a man named Silas Vance, no relation to Victoria, thankfully, hadn't an oppos. T just bought the 4 acres where my cabin sat. He had been granted the entire basin, including the land beneath the water, the access roads, and the surrounding hills as part of a timber and resource grant that had never been properly vacated. In the 1990s, when the developers came in to build the Cedar Ridge subdivision, they had apparently just assumed the land was unclaimed or public. They had filed a plat that was, for lack of a better word, a complete fantasy. They had built 60 luxury homes on land that, according to the federal government, still belonged to the estate I had just purchased in its entirety, hook, line, and sinker. I sat there in the dark attic, the only light coming from my computer screen, and I started to laugh because Victoria Vance wasn't in oppos. T just trespassing on my dock. She was living in a house that sat on land I legally owned, and she was paying an HOA to manage property that didn't in oppos. T belonged to them. But I needed to be sure, so I called in a favor from an old contact at the state archives, a woman named Sarah who could find a needle in a haystack if the haystack was made of paper. 2 days later, Sarah called me back, her voice sounding like she'd just seen a ghost, and she told me that not only was my patent valid, but it was, in quote, indivisible, in quote, meaning it couldn't in oppos, to be broken up without a specific act of Congress that had never happened. While I was gathering my strength, the harassment from the HOA reached a boiling point. I walked out to find a private security guard standing at the end of my dock, a guy in a black uniform who told me I was, in quote, trespassing on community waters, end quote. Then came my neighbor, a man named Arthur, a retired schoolteacher who looked like he hadn't in oppos. T slept in a month. He came over to my porch late that night, trembling as he handed me a piece of paper. It was a letter from Victoria, an internal memo telling the residents that if they didn't end oppos, T help, in quote, pressure, in quote, me to sell my property, their own dues would double to cover the legal costs of, in quote, removing the infection from our community, in quote, Arthur told me that Victoria had a secret deal with a massive commercial developer, a group called Apex Living, who wanted to build a 50-unit, glamping, resort right on the shoreline, effectively destroying the peace of the lake. For everyone else, but lining Victoria's pockets with a massive, consulting fee, It all made sense now. The aggression, the fake fines, the 911 calls. She wasn't an oppos. T trying to protect the neighborhood. She was trying to clear the path for a payday, and I was the only thing standing in the way of her turning this pristine lake into a crowded, noisy tourist trap. I thanked Arthur, told him to keep his head down, and then I spent the next 48 hours drafting the most beautiful, most devastating legal filing of my entire career. The monthly HOA meeting was held on a Thursday night in the community center, a building that, according to my maps, sat directly on top of what used to be Silas Vance's old cattle barn. I walked in about 10 minutes late, wearing the same flannel shirt and boots, and the room went dead silent as I moved down the aisle. Victoria was on the stage, standing behind a podium with a rendering of the Apex Spirit Lake Resort, projected on a screen behind her. She looked at me with this smug, victorious grin, like she was about to deliver the final blow, and she tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the hall. Mr. Thorne, she said, this is a meeting for members in good standing, and since you owe this association over $15,000 in unpaid fines, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I have security escort you out. I didn't oppose. T stopped walking until I was at the very front, leaning against the edge of the stage, and I just looked up at her, letting the silence build until people in the back started whispering. Victoria, I said, my voice projecting with that old courtroom resonance that I thought I'd forgotten, I think there's been a slight misunderstanding about who owns what in this room. I pulled out a stack of certified documents, each one stamped with the gold seal of the State Land Office, and I laid them on the table in front of the board members. You see, while you've been busy printing out orange stickers and making backroom deals with Apex Living, I've been doing a little bit of light reading, and it turns out that the 1994 subdivision plat for Cedar Ridge is about as legal as a $3 bill. Victoria laughed, a shrill, nervous sound, but her eyes were darting toward the documents, and she told the room I was, insane, and, desperate, I just ignored her and turned to the crowd, to the neighbors who have been bullied and fined for years. This land patent from 1868 supersedes every deed in this room, I announced, and because it was never legally subdivided or surrendered, the title to the roads you drive on, the park where your kids play, and the very ground under this building belongs to the Thorne estate. That's me, You could have heard a heartbeat in that room. The shock was so thick you could taste it. And then I turned back to Victoria, whose face had gone from magenta to a ghostly, sickly white. And as for your house, Victoria, the one on lot 14, it sits directly on top of a protected wetland easement defined in this patent, which means not only is your house technically an illegal structure, but you've been trespassing on my land every single night for the last 6 years. I handed a separate folder to the man sitting next to her, the HOA treasurer, a guy who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. In there, you'll find a formal demand for the immediate dissolution of the Cedar Ridge HOA for lack of standing, along with a notice of intent to sue Victoria Sterling personally for fraud, embezzlement of community funds, and tortious interference. The room erupted into absolute chaos. People were standing up, screaming questions, and Victoria was shrieking that I was a liar. But the treasurer was flipping through the pages, his hands shaking so hard the paper was rattling. He looked at Victoria, then back at the documents, and he just whispered, oh my God, he's right, the title chain is broken. It's all broken. Just then, the doors at the back opened, and Sheriff Miller walked in, but he wasn't in oppos. T alone, he had 2 investigators from the district attorney's office with him. It turns out that when I'd sent my filings to the county, I'd also included the evidence Benny and Arthur had given me about the kickbacks from Apex Living. Turns out Victoria had a secret bank account where she'd been depositing, reservation fees, for from the developer that belonged to the community. They walked right up onto that stage, and for the second time in a week, Victoria was told to be quiet, but this time it was followed by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. As they led her out past the neighbors she'd bullied for years, past the rendering of the resort that would never be built, she looked at me with a hatred that could have melted steel, but I just tipped an imaginary hat at her. The aftermath was a mess, obviously, because you can't in Oppos. T just tells 60 families they don into Oppos. T owned their land without causing a panic, but I didn't in Oppos. T moved here to be a tyrant or a king. Over the next few months, I worked with the county to do something that most of my old law partners thought was, in quote, suicidal, in quote, from a financial standpoint. I used my position as the primary title holder to facilitate a massive, one-time land swap. I officially surrendered my claims to the individual home lots so that every family in Cedar Ridge finally, for the first time, actually owned their homes free and clear. In exchange, the county agreed to turn the entire northern basin and the lake itself into a permanent, protected wildlife conservancy, no resorts, no motorized rentals, no commercial development ever. The HOA was dissolved by a unanimous vote of the residents, replaced by a simple voluntary community council with no power to fine anyone for the color of their mailbox, and Arthur was elected as the first chairperson. Victoria Sterling ended up taking a plea deal for embezzlement and real estate fraud. She spent 18 months in a state facility, and her house, the one she was so proud of, was sold to cover the restitution she owed to the community. I still live in my cabin, and I still fish off my dock every Tuesday morning, but now the only person who bothers me is Arthur, who usually just wants to know if the bass are biting or if I have any extra coffee. It's funny, I came out here looking for a quiet place to retire, thinking I was done with the law, but I guess sometimes you have to use the very thing you and Oppos, rerunning from to protect the thing you love. I saved the lake, I saved the neighborhood, and I proved that even the biggest bully in a power suit is no match for a man with a dusty map and a little bit of patience. But it makes me wonder if you found yourself in my shoes, holding the keys to the kingdom and the power to evict every annoying neighbor you've ever had. Would you have been the, end quote, benevolent king, end quote, and given it all away for the sake of the trees? Or would you have taken the money, sold the lake to the highest bidder, and watched the world burn from your new private island? I'm curious to hear what you do in the comments, because sometimes the line between justice and revenge is a lot thinner than we like to admit. Anyway, the sun's going down and the water's looking perfect. So this is Elias Thorne, signing off from a lake that finally belongs to everyone. Stay sharp out there and don an Oppos. T, let anyone tell you where you can in Oppos. T, cast your line.